Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Ballinger, and I am Vice President and Head of Communications for Saab in North America. And it's my pleasure and honor today to welcome you all on behalf of the Atlantic Council, the Snowcross Center for Strategy and Security, and Saab to a discussion on transatlantic security as part of the Atlantic Council's Commander Series initiative sponsored by Saab. For more than 80 years, Saab has been at the forefront of technology and innovation, designing and manufacturing products that enhance and enable national defense and increase the safety and security of the public. During that time, we've grown from a relatively small company dedicated to building airplanes for the Swedish government to a global provider of defense and security solutions. Here in the U.S., we've been active for more than 40 years supplying the U.S. government and industry with our products and technology. That includes more than a few advanced radar systems to the U.S. Navy over the years, a lot of ground combat weapon systems to our Army and camouflage systems, and most recently, some training aircraft for the U.S. Air Force together with our partner Boeing. Very proud of that. But in addition, we have also been actively promoting not only a close and robust U.S. and Swedish bilateral relationship, but also strong transatlantic relationships between the U.S., Canada, and Europe in general. As a global defense and security company, responsibility and commitment towards people and society are fundamental to us, and we strongly believe that continuing to build on the strong relationships established between our respective nations is essential in order to ensure our ability to promote peace and security for all in the future. Looking at the global situation around the world today, this effort is clearly more important than ever. That's also why our support of the Atlantic Council and our sponsorship of the Commander Series, now in its 9th year, are so valuable and important to us. Therefore, we're very pleased to see that so many of you could be here today, and it's my pleasure now to welcome Mr. Fred Kemp. Somebody told me to say the uncomparable and unmatched Mr. Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, to the podium to provide some introductory remarks and to introduce our distinguished guest. Fred Kemp.
I don't know who would have told you to say that, the brilliant, unmatched John Bellinger. So thank you for that kind introduction and for Saab North America's support for the Atlantic Council's Commander Series. This has been a very popular series over 9 years because we've attracted people of the stature and standing of someone like Admiral James G. Foggo. And congrats on winning the competition for the training aircraft. That is a big deal with Boeing, so congrats to some. The Commander Series is the Atlantic Council's flagship speaker series for senior military leaders. So we're delighted, Admiral Foggo, Commander of US Naval Forces Europe, Naval Forces Africa, and Joint Force Command Naples, to have you here this morning as part of this series to dive into the timely topic of the next Battle of the Atlantic. It's good to see you again, and it's just a shame that we're meeting here when there's just really so little going on in your field of vision. With less than 1 month until the kickoff of NATO's Trident Juncture 2018 exercise, this is a good moment to spotlight some of the key issues NATO faces in the maritime domain today. In an era of turbulence and renewed geopolitical competition, all you have to do is look at some of the news coming out this week regarding Russia and China. NATO faces new challenges in this domain at a scale not seen for decades. Russia's resurgent navy is once again active in the North Atlantic and could seriously threaten NATO reinforcement efforts across the Atlantic in the case of a crisis or war. The turbulence around the southern Mediterranean also holds implications for maritime security, with violence in the Middle East and North Africa having spawned massive migrant flows across the Mediterranean, as well as other illicit activities. And within the alliance, strategic inattention for many years to the role for NATO in the maritime domain has persisted, though I think also by no means only because of the Atlantic Council's input, but also because of the Atlantic Council's input, that's been shifting. And Magnus, are you here? Where are you, Magnus? I guess he may have had to drop out, but we have a book coming out, and Magnus Nordman, who's been with us many years, he has a book coming out beginning of next year focused on this issue. In response to this state of affairs, the Atlantic Council has built a body of work to help inform an effort to rebuild NATO's role in the maritime domain. Today, it will be an absolute privilege to hear from Admiral Foggo directly on these issues. In 3 weeks, you will command NATO's Exercise Trident Juncture 2018, which will be the largest NATO exercise since 2002, if I'm not mistaken. Trident Juncture will test NATO's ability to plan and conduct a major collective defense operation in and around Norway and the North Atlantic. On the eve of such an event, there's a lot for us to consider, from the strengthening of collective deterrence in response to Russian aggressiveness to multilateral efforts to improve capabilities, readiness, and decision-making. Luckily, we have the person here with us today who can discuss these and other issues best. So it's a pleasure to have you here today and welcome you again. With more than 3 decades of distinguished service in the U.S. Navy, Admiral Foggo has long been a strong voice for U.S. leadership in transatlantic maritime security. He took command of JFC Naples in October 2017. Prior to that, from 2016 to 17, he served as Director of Navy Staff at the Pentagon, and before that, as Commander of U.S. 6th Fleet, Naples. Ashore, he has served in a variety of assignments, most notably as Executive Assistant to the Director of Naval Nuclear Propulsion, as Division Chief, Joint Staff for Western Europe and the Balkans, as Executive Assistant to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, as Executive Officer to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. In short, he knows his stuff. And I'm delighted for the opportunity, and we're delighted for the opportunity to hear your insights today. Before I turn it over to the Admiral, let me encourage you all to join the conversation on Twitter by following @Atlantic Council and using the hashtag #StrongerWithAllies. With that, please join me in welcoming Admiral Foggo to the stage.
Water here. Thank you, Fred, very much for that very nice introduction. John, thank you for being the sponsor here today from Saab. This is a great opportunity for me to see many, many different friends and partners and allies, people who I've known in the Washington area and who I see often overseas. Ian Clementine, thank you for the invitation to come here today. Ian and I go back a long way. We were classmates at the Kennedy School of Government in 1986. In the Masters in Public Administration program. I think you were doing an MPP at the time, but we're in the same classes. And we have so many friends that we still keep in touch with. In fact, one in the news today, Dr. Konstanz Stelzenmuller, who's talking a little bit about some of the events that are going on within NATO and Russia in light of the recent defense ministerial in the last couple of days. So it's my honor to be here. I have a lot I want to tell you, and that's a problem for me because I always overrun my time. So I'm going to launch right into this, and I'll go through a few slides as teasers to try to get some questions and answers. That picture is a picture of ball tops, which I had the pleasure of commanding twice in 2015 and 16, still going strong. By comparison, there were 5,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines involved in ball tops in the 2 years that I commanded. In about 3 weeks, I'll command Trident Juncture with 45,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines from all the 29 nations and partners that will participate. In fact, with the partners, we're at 31. And so importantly, Sweden and Finland will join us for that exercise. A couple of years ago, I wrote a paper which many of you have asked me about over time. Sorry, I'm coming on the downside of the flu here, so I'll have to take a few sips as we're going through so I don't lose my voice. Called The Fourth Battle of the Atlantic. And that was a call to arms, a warning order, if you will, that we have to pay attention to the Atlantic. And of course, that's what the Atlantic Council is all about. It's about the Atlantic Bridge. I'm a firm transatlanticist. I've had 5 tours in Europe. I was born into NATO in Land Component Command, Mönchengladbach in Rheindahlem, where my father served. And ever since, I have been a part of the very fabric of the Treaty of 1949. And I think it was no mistake that the Department of Defense sent me back for the 3rd time in Naples to be the commander of Joint Force Command, NATO. And every day I wake up and pinch myself having the best job of my life. I'm truly enjoying the leadership opportunities and the challenges, and we're going to talk about some of those challenges today. Slide. This slide represents the geography, if you will, of transatlanticism. There's an author, a famous author, one who's very friendly to the Naval Academy, who taught there and who's occupied this lectern many times, named Robert Kaplan. In his books, he maintains that this is not just the maritime decade, it's the maritime century. And what you see on this slide is the AIS tracks for ships, automated information system for tracking ships greater than 300 metric tons in accordance with U.S. Or the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. And you can see that the maritime plays a huge role in commerce, in prosperity, security, and stability. And so we have to have strong navies and strong military forces, joint forces, strong partners and allies to keep up with that. There's been, in the last 25 years, a 400% increase in shipping by the sea. I was just talking to Admiral John Richardson about this very point yesterday as we get ready for our annual Navy ball. And we want to talk to our sailors and our Marines about why we do what we do. Since 1990, offshore oil and gas exploration has doubled from platforms ranging in the number of 3,000 to currently 6,000. Undersea cables carry over 90% of our international information globally. I consider them a sea line of communication, and they must be protected. World economies depend on a free and open ocean, and that's what your navies do. But our maritime commons have not always been free and uncontested, and that brings me to the subject of the battles of the Atlantic. Slide. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, so I won't belabor the point. First battle of the Atlantic, of course, was World War I. Now, there were great sea battles fought in World War I. We study those. The Battle of Jutland, where arguably you could say that the firing rate, the accuracy, the powder, and the agility of the German fleet was better than the Royal Navy. But it was a Pyrrhic victory for both sides, incredible losses on both sides. Another battle was raging out in the Atlantic, and that was the battle in the undersea domain. And the war started, in fact, with the torpedoing of Lusitania by U-21 and Captain Lieutenant Otto Schweiger, who was immortalized in a New York Times bestseller called Dead Wake by Eric Larson. I commend the book to you. It's an incredible story of how this war came about as a result of the torpedoing of that ship. One ship, one submarine of 6 operationally effective at the time. There was another captain of a submarine who was not as successful as Schweiger. He was torpedoed and sunk, but he lived and spent the rest of the war in a British prisoner of war camp in Malta, and that was the head of the Kriegsmarine in World War II, Field Marshal Dönitz. So Fleet Admiral Dönitz. The slide on the lower left insert is a picture of the class of 1910. I visited Flensburg. We talked to, that's their Naval Academy, a few weeks ago, and we talked about great battles at sea and how navies have changed over time. Dönitz had a lot of time to reflect while he was in that prisoner of war camp, and he came up with the Rudel tactic, Wolfpack tactics, that he used in the German Navy and the submarine force quite effectively in the Second World War. Slide. So we know that the First World War didn't solve the problem. In fact, I put this slide up in honor of my father, who hit the beach in Normandy, albeit July of 1944. There's still a lot of fighting going on then, and crawled across Northern Europe on his belly until he demobilized in September 1945. Operation Overlord. Look at all that stuff. That would not have happened if we had lost the Second Battle of the Atlantic. The Second Battle of the Atlantic raged for the first couple of years of the war, and the Germans almost brought us to our knees with the Wolfpack tactics and with Dönitz's cunning and the bravery of the German submariners, many of whom, probably over 3/4 of whom, never came back. Technology won the day. So Lend-Lease, of course, the ability to produce convoys at a very rapid rate in our industrial base, which we are trying to do again as we grow to a 355-ship Navy, and ASDIC, undersea sonar detection of those submarines. radars from aircraft, and lots of aircraft that sunk many of the submarines in the latter half of the war and brought Donitz and his submarine force to his knees. So the war's over. And, you know, perhaps to quote Francis Fukuyama, end of history at that time? Well, there was a lull, German doctrine, and then slide. We're into the third Battle of the Atlantic, the Cold War. So sometimes I put up a picture representing a Cold War of a Russian ship and a U.S. ship. Today I put up a picture from 22 June 1985 of my submarine, USS Sea Devil, surfaced at the geographic North Pole under Commander Rich Meese, who preceded me at the Kennedy School and was probably the reason why I went. He's the guy with the Royal Navy turtleneck and the silver hair in the middle, very, very handsome Hollywood guy. So we were sailing around the North Atlantic, the Baltic, and the Arctic Ocean at the time, waging what we believed was America's business in the Cold War. This has recently been captured in Secretary John Lehman's new book, Oceans Ventured. I reviewed that for the United States Naval Institute, and I was struck by the fact that in 1986, the maritime strategy was about a great power competition. We're in a great power competition now, but there's a couple of great powers we're competing with. Back then, it was just bipolarity and the Russians, and we won through sheer brute force. Remember, during that time, not a shot was fired. Technically, not a shot was fired. So we won through our ability to outpace and exceed the Russians. And if you read Lehman's book, you find that in the end, Gorbachev told General Akrameyev, their chief of defense, hey, stop operating forward. Bring your forces back to defend the homeland. And that's when we knew we had them. And of course, the wall came down in 1989, victory. And then we did have Francis Fukuyama and the end of history, but not so fast. Slide. Some memories from memory lane. Articles in the paper today about Poland and Poland's desire to have us permanently present in their country. We're building a missile facility there that's eventually going to be passed over to me from the Missile Defense Agency, as was the missile facility in Romania, and we're very happy about that. I went to the 100th anniversary of the Polish Navy, and I ran into my old friend, the fleet commander, Admiral Zarekta. First time we met during Baltops in Gdynia, Poland, he said to me, you ever been to the Baltic before? Oh, yes, sir. I was 6th Fleet Commander. I was here in 1985 on USS Sea Devil. We had to drive in on the surface. It was a very long maneuvering watch through the Kattegats, Skagerrak, and Stora belts. Danish pilots harassed relentlessly by Warsaw Pact ships, especially the East Germans. He goes, what's the name of that ship again, your submarine again? I said, USS Sea Devil. He goes, you see that ship over there? Yeah, I said, it looks like a Russian AGI. He goes, well, it was a Warsaw Pact AGI. That was my first command. I was a lieutenant. I was a lieutenant, he was a lieutenant. And he said, I remember the name of your submarine. We were out there looking for you. So we're on the opposite sides of the Iron Curtain, and then we're fleet commanders together. So he says to me, well, we're out for the fleet review on the Navigator, which is one of these old AGIs. Would you like to come up and say hello to the president? I go, president's on board? He goes, yeah, he surprised us. So we went up to the bridge, and there's President Duda. I think I was the only person, the only flag officer allowed to come up and do the review with the president. And Admiral Zarekta told him that story. And he said, is that really true? You two guys, opposite sides, and then fleet? Yeah, that's true. That's what happened. So it just goes to show you what goes around comes around. But we're friends now. And the Poles are key allies. And they want our presence, and they want our partnership, and they want to be, and they will be part of Trident Juncture, as they are in all of our operations in the East, to provide stability and security. Slide. The fourth battle, you know, when I talk about fourth battle of the Atlantic, people go, well, you're just talking about the North Atlantic. No, actually, I'm talking about the Arctic Ocean. I'm talking about the Baltic. I'm talking about the Mediterranean, Black Sea. Those bodies of water that actually feed, or the Atlantic runs into. It's very important. We also now have to face the fact that the fourth battle has spread into other domains, like the cyber domain. You read a lot about that in the newspaper today with the hacking of OPCW in Denmark and the United Kingdom. One of my favorite books is War in 140 Characters by David Patrikarakos. The actual lessons learned out of this book, he's got a lot in there about the use of social media, Russian bots and trolls and how they operate to change stories in their favor, how the manipulation of the internet and cyber attacks are taking place. It's a very good book, but what I took away from it was that if the prelude to war, in other words, the war in the social media space or in cyberspace, becomes the actual war itself, then we have to rethink how we're doing strategy and tactics and doctrine. And a great example is what happened in Crimea, where hybrid warfare was in effect. Little green men walked in, later there was a referendum, and before you know it, that territory on the map turns red, and we do not recognize that as an illegal annexation. But now there's a bridge, the Kerch Bridge, which connects Russia with the Crimea, and there is commerce going across that bridge, which is of no benefit to the country who rightfully owns the territory of Crimea. New book out by Peter Singer. He introduced it at the War College. It just downloaded on my Kindle last night, so I haven't read it, but I heard Peter talk about it. It's very much like War in 140 characters. It's important that we in the military pay attention to this, because this is a big part of Trident Juncture as well, our strategic communications. My public affairs officer is an 06, he's here with me today, and we're going to do some press later on. Slide. We expand, as I said, the Fourth Battle of the Atlantic in the area of geography. This is an expedition which was headed by Artur Chilangarov, advisor to President Putin, putting the Russian flag on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean around the geographic North Pole. Now, we landed on the moon in 1968 with Neil Armstrong, planted a flag, but we didn't call it our 51st state. So it's important to recognize the fact that the Russians have remobilized 7 bases up in the Arctic, and that makes some of our allies and partners nervous, which is why we do things like Trident Juncture, to provide reassurance, to let them know that we can get there and be there quickly for them. Now, there's been no nefarious activity from those 7 bases in the Arctic as of yet, but it's important that we watch them and that we make sure that there's proper behavior there. And it is their right to put their people there because it's their territory. We've seen creation of new classes of all sorts of submarines and ships. I'm more concerned with submarine warfare, Dolgoruki, Severodvinsk, Petersburg. The 6 new kilos now operating in the Black Sea, and 2 of which have remained in the Mediterranean and have launched the Caliber missile from the Mediterranean. The Caliber missile is an impressive missile, a land attack cruise missile, and if launched from any of these bodies of water, including the Caspian that I've talked about, can range any one of the capitals in Europe. It's important that we have situational awareness and know what the Russians are doing in the undersea space at all times. However, the news is not all negative, not all bad. I think in response to that call to arms in 2016, there's a lot that we have done. We have reactivated the Second Fleet. We have instantiated and created Joint Force Command Naples. We have honed our theater ASW skills. We are working much closer with partners and allies, and we're about to launch on one of the biggest exercises in an Article 5 defense of an allied nation since 2002. Slide. Other areas of threat. That's Vladimir Putin driving across the Kerch Bridge. Finished early. Started in May 2015. Completed early, $3.7 billion to build that bridge, 18.1 kilometers connecting Russia with Crimea. And I don't think anybody asked the Ukraine's permission to make this project a reality. Slide. Along with the bridge goes the entry point to the Sea of Azov. If you're keeping up with this lately, there's been some irresponsible activity in the Sea of Azov in the last couple of months, and the Ukrainians are not happy about that. Russians have delayed shipping, held them at sea, unable to enter port, or in port, unable to go to sea. This is costing the Ukraine millions of dollars a year, and it's an unfair practice. Now, when I asked the question, well, who controls the Sea of Azov? Many of you are smarter than I am, but it's under an Article 123 of the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, and that article says that states bordering on or enclosed in a semi-enclosed sea shall cooperate with one another and exercise their rights and performance of their duties under this convention. So it's Russia and Ukraine that control that body of water, and there's not a lot of collaboration and cooperation there. So most recently you saw that the Ukrainians boldly sent a couple of ships for a freedom of navigation exercise into the Sea of Azov, and there was a limited reaction on the part of the Russians. So the Ukrainians have shown that they intend to operate there, they intend to exercise their rights under Article 123, and I laud them for that. So what's NATO doing about it? We operate about 125 days of the year in the Black Sea, exercise Breeze, exercise Sea Breeze. We just completed exercise Sea Breeze 18 with 18 nations, 3,000 personnel, 19 ships, a submarine and aircraft. And this is reassurance for our friends to the east. And we will continue to operate there because the model or the protocol of trying to block the Sea of Azov will not stand in the Black Sea. And with our friends, the Bulgarians, Romanians, Georgians, Ukrainians, and the Turks, we will continue as NATO to operate there and provide reassurance. Slide. My last slide, I talked about what else have we done, Trident Juncture, and the return of the Harry S. Truman. So this week was our 3- and 4-star conference. We talked a lot about dynamic force employment, how the Harry S. Truman came to the Mediterranean and stayed in the Mediterranean, operated in the Eastern Mediterranean, supported Admiral Lisa Franchetti during Baltops 2018 from the Adriatic with air power, something that had not been done before. Then she went home for a brief maintenance availability, and now she's back. And now she's operating up north, and she will be a part of Trident Juncture, joining with NATO as a NATO member and providing projection of power and presence and stability and security in that North Atlantic. Again, 45,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, over 60 aircraft, 120 aircraft, over 60 ships, and 10,000 rolled or tracked vehicles. So we're really testing our response to an Article 5, our ability to move rapidly. The Very High Readiness Joint Task Force will move into Norway to provide this Article 5 defense. And even more importantly, we're testing our ability to conduct operations in the 6th domain of warfare, and that is logistics, which is so important. When you have 45,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines and all of their kit, you've got to get it there. So that's several lifts of aircraft, several ro-ros or sea lift ships that are going in. Then you have to put the vehicles on the ground. The Norwegians believe in a total defense concept. They're all in the defense of their own nation and the alliance. We are there with them as alliance partners. I look forward to being there with my deputy, Lieutenant General Janot. He's a Canadian Army officer, very experienced, has served in Afghanistan. He'll be on the ground conducting the land campaign. I'll be where I belong, operating from the sea. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that's kind of a little bit of the state of the art in my theater. What's going on in the 4th Battle of the Atlantic. I'll stop there, and I know that Ian has a plan for some commentary and questions. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ian Brzezinski. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and as says on the agenda, I have the privilege of moderating this discussion with Admiral Foggo. Let me thank John and Bellinger and Saab for supporting this series. It's been a great pillar of the Atlantic Council. And Jamie, Admiral Foggo, I just want to thank you for what I thought was a very kind of historical, but also frank, if not provocative, overview of the force balance and the dynamics driving Atlantic security today. And on a personal note, you mentioned that we crossed paths when you were a lieutenant at the Kennedy School, and it's been amazing and inspirational to see your career going from lieutenant to a 4-star commander serving our country, and we should all be grateful for your service in uniform. Thank you. You painted a fairly stark picture of the Atlantic, and you talked a little bit about what the United States is doing in response to increasing Russian maritime capabilities. You mentioned the developments in the submarine realm. You talked about their aggression, not just in Ukraine. You could say Georgia. You could also mention their provocations. You could add to that your increased level of aggressive patrolling. And I wanted to bring you kind of into the NATO domain and give us your insights on where the alliance is standing in addressing this maritime threat. And we're developing a new maritime strategy for the US Navy in light of the new global situation, the new situation that features great power competition. If I understand correctly, the NATO maritime strategy actually dates back to 2011. And it was really configured for an era where we were still fundamentally assuming that we were going to have a constructive cooperative relationship with Russia, and our maritime assets were being directed to conflicts other than great power conflicts, counter-piracy, patrolling against WMD, and such. So in light of that, is it time to update the NATO maritime strategy? And if so, what should the next one look like?
Well, it's a great point, Ian, and this is something that's been discussed amongst maritime commanders now since 2011. I've been part of that conversation. And I think one of the forcing functions for a broader discussion of maritime strategy in NATO is the return of Second Fleet, which will be part and parcel of Joint Force Command Norfolk. And so we have these maritime entities in NATO, Joint Force Command Brunson, which does bodies of water to the north, but he also, General Marchio, is in charge of resolute support in Afghanistan. So we all have several functions that we perform. For me, the Mediterranean and the South, NATO Strategic Direction South. For Vice Admiral Franchetti, who is the 6th Fleet Commander, and also my Deputy Commander as Naval Forces Europe, she is the Commander of Strike Force NATO, which I once occupied, and now she has, and is the leader of Baltops. She works very hard with Vice Admiral Clive Johnstone in the integration of American forces, particularly carrier strike groups and amphibious readiness groups, into the NATO maritime. Clive runs the standing NATO maritime groups, both MCM and conventional warship groups, and does a great job with that. He's all over the theater. So now we're, by NAC approval, we've added a new Joint Force Command Norfolk. It won't be all or just about the maritime. It's a joint command, but that commander will be Vice Admiral Woody Lewis, and I think he'll be looking from Norfolk to the east and to the North Atlantic in any way that he can help. And so we are in a discussion right now about how does the command and control work? How does the sharing of areas or domains work? And we don't have the answers yet. We've been in this dialogue for a while, and something led by General Scaparrotti as the Supreme Allied Commander. Now, is there a definitive plan or a date or some kind of a milestone for a new maritime strategy? The frank answer to your question is there is not. That would be something that the military committee would and the North Atlantic Council would have to ask for, a demand signal. But invariably, we're going to have this discussion anyway, because we have a new JFC who's going to integrate with us and fight with us and work with us on the various strategies, graduated response plans that take place throughout the theater and the maritime. So I'm excited about that, and I think that bodes well for the maritime of those nations. I think there are 21 of the 29 in NATO, perhaps 22 now with Montenegro, that actually have maritime forces.
You've written in the past about the modernization of Russian subsurface assets. There's a lot written about increasing Russian long-range strike capabilities, coastal batteries, anti-ship missiles, and such. And it's a positive news that the alliance is beginning to address this challenge. The new Atlantic Command, the United States is putting in the new Second Fleet. But that structure and headquarters, does the alliance have the assets, the capital ships necessary to ensure a safe and secure passage of American personnel, North American assets from North America to Europe in a contingency? Or are we at a position now where perhaps there might be a gap that we have to fill?
Well, you're absolutely right in that with the illegal annexation of Crimea, it has given the Russian Federation an opportunity to establish more anti-access and area denial capabilities there. So S-300, S-400 Bastion weapon system, anti-ship cruise missiles. They're pouring more into Kaliningrad in the Baltic. And they're establishing a more robust A2AD capability in the Eastern Mediterranean. There are a number of initiatives that are underway and studies that are underway. I think Dr. Ullman is here. He's spearheading the porcupine defense of an area in the Black Sea, which might be a counter strategy to go after the buildup of Russian forces. But I am confident that we are able to act with the high technologically superior capabilities that we have within not just the United States Navy, but all of NATO. That's not to say that we're not going to get to areas that are going to be contested. And we're going to have to operate as we do as a sophisticated group of navies in order to deny the adversary the capability or the opportunity to keep us out of areas that are international waters, because we absolutely and categorically refuse to be restricted in our ability to conduct freedom of navigation operations in international waters. That won't happen. So I talked about the Sea of Azov. That's something controlled by Russia and the Ukraine. I would not expect us to go in there. I would expect us to continue to operate in the Black Sea. We do that. About 125 days for NATO and about 125 days for U.S. warships. So we got 250 days covered throughout the year. We'll continue to do that. Same in the Mediterranean. It's getting very, very busy in the Eastern Mediterranean. You saw recently the buildup of several Russian forces and Russian ships that came out and operated for a month just around Tartus and Latakia because there was ongoing operations in Idlib, and they felt the necessity to flex their muscles. That did not deter us from operating U.S. warships there. It does not deter us from operating U.S. or NATO warships in the Baltic because there's a buildup in Kaliningrad. It does not deter us from operating in and around the GI-UK gap and up north, and the carrier will prove that during Trident Juncture.
You had a picture of one of your colleagues and yourself punching through the ice in the Arctic.
Yes.
You had a picture of the Russian submarine planting that flag that created such controversy. So the United States clearly has a long history of operating fairly robustly in the Arctic, but the alliance, NATO, doesn't. In fact, the alliance has been very hesitant to actually have a standing commitment to operate regularly in the high north. Is it time for that to change? Should the alliance have a more regular, persistent presence for surveillance operations, ASW operations in the high north, in the Arctic, in light of the way the Russians are operating and the way they're building up their forces in the Arctic?
Right. So we talked about those 7 reoccupied bases that are actually Russian territory in the Arctic that raised the eyebrows of some of our Scandinavian partners and friends, particularly the Norwegians, and to a certain extent the Swedes and the Finns, which is why they're with us in exercise Trident Juncture. This comes down to a matter of location and geography, and where is your sovereign country actually located? Do you have contiguous territory that touches on the Arctic Ocean? Are you a member of the Arctic Council? And do you have capability to be able to operate up there in terms of icebreakers, in terms of capable warships that are ice hardened, or submarines that are capable of operating up there? So I would welcome additional interest on the part of our NATO allies. It is, in the big scheme of things, a small body of water. We don't want to over-militarize or overcrowd it. Right now, I think the situation is stable. We're watching very carefully, and we're working very closely with our Norwegian friends in maintaining a safe, secure, and stable environment in the Arctic. A lot of this depends on the Russians and their behavior. And it is my desire that they continue to behave responsibly in the Arctic, and they do not restrict access to the Arctic. As the ice continues to recede, there are other great powers that are interested. China is one who has economic interests in coming over the top of the Arctic Circle with some of their commerce. As I said, 90% of our commerce goes by the sea, and there's another route that may become more advantageous for somebody like China in their one belt, one road strategy. So I think in the big scheme of things, as a naval officer, it would be in all of our interests to do this peacefully and securely. And there's going to be a lot of cruise ship traffic up there, and sooner or later somebody's going to get in trouble and somebody's going to have to go and help them. We need that capability too. That's why the icebreaker is so important in our inventory.
Before I open up the dialogue to the questions from the audience,
Yes.
let me throw one last one at you. You've been one of the most ardent and energetic advocates of larger scale exercises. So you have pushed ball tops into new realms. You're now leading NATO's largest exercise, at least from 2002, if not since the end of the Cold War, Trident Juncture. And that's, of course, an exercise that's going to bring together air, land, sea components totaling 45,000 personnel. So it's significant. But to be pointed, the Russians are just concluding an exercise in their far east in Siberia, Rostok 18, which they claim is 300,000. Zapad was somewhere between 100 and 120,000. They regularly do large-scale exercises, and they do snap exercises up to 50,000. Are we exercising at the right level of magnitude to address the threat that we face from the east? Or do we need to continue expanding our exercises in size and in terms of intensity?
Well, that is a fantastic question. It's one that I anticipated, and I think it's very important that we talk about this in our exercise plan. 45,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, 10,000 rolling vehicles, and all the greater than 60 ships and aircraft that are up there is certainly enough to demonstrate the capability that we want to demonstrate. First and foremost, that the Secretary General uses these terms all the time, and I love it. We deter and we defend. At the same time, we dialogue with the Russians. The symbol of my headquarters is the St. Mark's Lion from Venice. And the lion carries a sword to defend, but he has his paw on the Book of Peace, Pax, for deterrence. And the dialogue takes place in things like our Chief of Defense dialogue with Gerasimov, General Gerasimov, with General Scaparotti's dialogue with General Gerasimov, and in my own headquarters, the Incidents at Sea Agreement with the Russians, which takes place pretty religiously every year, where we sit at the table and talk about some of these untoward incidents taking place in the previous year. So deter, defend, and dialogue. NATO has no desire to conduct offensive operations or attack any country. It's not in our interest. It's not in our charter. It's not part of the Washington Treaty of 1949. We defend and we deter. And we demonstrate our capability to do that through an exercise plan, which is very robust, and it is very well planned and laid out. It's also very transparent and open. I've been talking about this now for over 3 months. Everybody knows the date it starts, 24, 25 October as we roll in. When it ends, about the 7th of November, and then we come back and do a command post exercise in my headquarters to qualify for the NATO response force. We know the size, we know the location, we know the rationale. It's an Article 5 defense of a great NATO ally, Norway, and there are 31 partners or nations, members of the alliance, that are going to be there with us. It's an OSCE event, so therefore there will be observers. The Russians are invited. There's an invitation out for them to come, and they will be able to see the exercise openly and freely as we're up and operating on the country of Norway. I wouldn't really know the number of Vostok or what happened there because I wasn't invited. There hasn't been the same transparency. There hasn't been an openness that occurred. There were other great powers that were involved, but I'm not worried about that. I look at 45,000 in Trident Juncture as an effective fighting force. The capability there is unmatched anywhere in the world. There is no alliance like the NATO alliance. Nobody can touch us. If you look at just some statistics from the alliance, the overall GDP of NATO is 38 trillion euros. 38 trillion euros. 0.9 trillion euros are spent on defense. 3.7 million personnel active under arms. 3.7 reserve, and 1 million civilians, for a total of 8.1 million in a population of Europe that approaches 932 million people. That's pretty good numbers, and that's a pretty capable alliance, and that's incredible capability. Technology allows us to demonstrate a force multiplier effect where we can do things that they can't with tools of the trade, techniques, tactics, and procedures. So I'm pretty comfortable with the size, the battle rhythm, the periodicity, and I'm not worried about Vostok.
That's reassuring. Thank you. Let me open it up and just ask people, when you ask a question, give us your name, tell us your affiliation, and be right to the point, because we'll only have a limited amount of time. I see this one individual. Yes, sir.
My name is Walter Jurasik. I am Polish American Congress member. From observation, what I see it, and I ask the question, Putin is not afraid to have a conflict with the West because the Western public is not ready for any conflict. Russian public is rather ready for any conflict because that's what the Russian experienced World War I, World War II, the same as in Poland. Don't you think even Putin is more afraid to have a conflict with Poland than with the West?
Mr. Jurassic, thank you for your question. And thank you for being a member of the Polish-American Congress. Great friends, great allies, great partners, incredible capability in Poland as part of our alliance, and great host for our new missile facility. You mentioned that the Russians may wish for some kind of a conflict or push for some kind of a conflict for the West. I don't blame you for thinking that way when you look at it in terms of recent history. Georgia, Ukraine, some of the nefarious activity that's taken place in the United Kingdom, Salisbury, Novichok recently announced from the Defense Ministerial the Novator missile and its range, which is a INF treaty buster. These things are all of great concern. But they're just that. They're things of great concern that we must watch. For Russia to enter into a conflict with the West would be a huge risk. And there is a risk calculation on the part of the Russian people, the Russian forces, and certainly the Russian president. And I don't think that they would take any risk where they were uncertain that they would either dominate or win or achieve the objectives that they wanted to achieve. And with an alliance as strong as we have, it is not in their risk calculus to do that. And that's why we have to remain strong. And we have to have resolve and solidarity as an alliance. And it's countries like you that make us stronger from Poland's perspective. Thank you.
Hans?
Hans Benendijk from...
Hey, Hans, how are you? Good to see you.
Sir. With Rand and newly with the Atlantic Council. I'd like to ask you for, it's a follow-up really to the last question, an evaluation of the state of deterrence today. Since 2014, the Alliance has done a lot to try to enhance its deterrence. VJTF, forward deploying battle groups, the Readiness Initiative, the command structure reforms, your exercises, other exercises. So a lot has been done. Some argue that it's not enough and that more still needs to be done to really cement the deterrence that we're looking for. So could you give us your evaluation of where we are in that process? Summits tend to be the place where additional steps are taken in deterrence. We have a summit coming up again next year.
We do.
As we look at that, what should we do to enhance deterrence further?
That's a great question, and we can always be stronger. And I think there's been a big push on the part of U.S. leadership, and particularly the President of the United States, to increase defense spending throughout the alliance. And most recently, in the last week, from the Defense Ministerial, I saw Secretary Mattis had commented on, virtually all NATO countries have increased spending to some extent. And there is a goal to get to 2% of GDP by, I think, 2024. And my PA will fact check me on that. But we've seen some significant increases in expenditures in defense, which is recognition of the fact that defense and the alliance is important to NATO and to the countries who apportion to NATO. The reason I think we're having another summit out of sequence here in June, July of next year is because we may have another NATO member, and I'm very pleased about that. People want to come and be a part of us because they see defense and deterrence as being so important. And so there's the increase in defense spending, which is helping us, and then there are the innovative ideas and strategies and concepts and policies, such as one that they agreed to at the summit on July 11th, the 30-30-30-30 plan. And although that is not permanently ensconced in NATO doctrine today, we're exercising it in spirit in Trident Juncture with the VJTF. The numbers of those folks that will move, VJTF is supposed to move very rapidly, kind of like the United States TIP-FID, the time phase force deployment doctrine. in a 30-day period in order to respond to a crisis in the alliance. And so we're going to move all this kit quickly up into Norway, and I think that has a sobering deterrent effect on any adversary that might choose to cross the line and try to take territory or violate sovereignty. So I feel pretty good about that. I feel good about the fact that we can get there quickly. There is a political aspect to this, obviously. In the event that there's a crisis, then political leadership has to agree to whatever article it's going to be, if it's an Article 5 or something else that we're going to agree to help one of our allies out with. But I think that the forces are training and ready to respond. So, like you said, VJTF, NIFUs, enhanced forward presence, the battalions that are up in the Baltics, the 30-30-30-30 plan. These are all great. We have Marines in Varnes in Norway. We've recently doubled the number from about 300 to 700. And I love to quote the Command Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, Sergeant Major Green, who was up there in a press conference, and somebody said, well, how many Marines do you have here? And at the time we had 300 Marines. And the comment was something like, well, that's not very many. And he said, hey, 300 Marines today, 3,000 Marines tomorrow. And no kidding, we can do that. C-17 list, boom, in a heartbeat, we can get there. And so that's where the alliance is going. They're emulating that ability to move quickly, to respond. And that's why logistics is that most important sixth domain of warfare I talked about, and it kind of feeds into the narrative on deterrence. You got to be there to be present, to deter. And so we've recognized that. We're working hard to get there. Great question, thanks very much.
Fred?
Admiral, thank you for being here. Fred Kemp. I wonder if we could go a little bit geographically further afield and briefly address what you see as your highest priority with your Naval Forces Africa hat on. What's your highest priority? And how do you see, we know a lot about China's economic activities in Africa. How do you assess their military activities? And I know there's not enough time to discuss this in all the details, so maybe we'll even have you back at some point to have an Africa session.
Absolutely, Fred. Thanks for the question. It's not just Naval Forces Africa, but it's also NATO that's concerned about Africa. So I have the benefit of being a component commander for General Waldhauser. AFRICOM celebrates its 10th anniversary this year, and we're quite happy about that, and we're quite happy with the work, excellent work that that team has done up there. NATO has realized that in order to be truly a strategic alliance and organization, it must have a 360-degree approach. You hear this all the time. We're doing pretty well in the north, and we've added value and assets and equipment and brick and mortar, such as the multinational division headquarters in Bucharest, Romania, which I stood up in the spring of this year in the east. The Balkans is always an area where we are concerned, but where we are lacking or where we have not done as much as in strategic direction south, and that is portions of the Middle East, North Africa, Africa, all the way down to the Pan-Sahel. And so NATO has created the strategic direction south hub for establishing safe and secure environment and stability in Africa to attempt to assist our African partners. This doesn't mean boots on the ground. When I go around and I ask people about why did NATO and the NAC vote to establish a strategic direction south hub, why did they give me precious resources of 80 personnel in my headquarters, civilian and military, from all over the alliance to come and establish a place in my headquarters, which is both classified and unclassified transparent membrane. People from MedSense Sans Frontières and United Nations without clearances can come in and talk to us, and there's been a ton of them that have. Why'd we do that? And invariably in that straw poll, people go, illegal migration. And I say, no, that's a symptom of a much broader problem. The problem is lack of governance, lack of rule of law, and development. And that's what we're trying to do. We connect, we consult, and we collaborate with African partners, NGOs, United Nations, African Union. Recently, Paul Kagame, President of Rwanda, interim president of the African Union, had a meeting with Jens Stoltenberg in New York. I think that relationship is turning out to be a good one, which has many possibilities of benefit to NATO's strategic direction south and to Africa. And so we're down there trying to help. I actually have people inside the African Union headquarters from NATO. The goal is to help stabilize, establish security through robust military forces, police forces who are ethical and act responsibly, to try to assist our partners with the elimination of corruption, to stem the tide of illegal migration, because people leave because they don't have a safe haven. And when I talk to some of the folks down in these countries in Africa, they want the same things that you and I do. They want a job, they want a house, they want security for their family and for themselves. And so this will not happen in a year. We stood up July 11th. AFRICOM's been here for 10 years. This is the long game. I'm going to Brussels Monday and Tuesday. And I always remind my friends in Brussels about this, that this is the long game. We're in it for an investment over a decade or more before we're going to see progress. But it is absolutely the right thing to do. And Fred, thank you so much for asking the question.
Ambassador?
Ambassador Bradke, how are you, sir? Good to see you.
Good to see you. Bob Bradke, formerly of the State Department, now with the McCain Institute. Admiral, listening to you describe the threats we face in the North Atlantic, I can't help thinking back to when we were in Norfolk in the early 2000s to take down the flag of Sackland.
Sure.
Did we make a mistake bringing Sackland to an end, and how is what we're going to be doing now, NATO doing now in Norfolk, going to be different?
Well, the Supreme Allied Command for Transformation, sir, has kind of filled in where Sackland was, with the exception of the operational. And the operational portion of Sackland was absorbed in what is now Fleet Forces Command. What you see with the stand-up of Joint Force Command in Norfolk is an entity that will assist with security in the North Atlantic, with the ability to integrate forces from the United States, joint forces, not just naval forces or marine forces, into NATO in the event of a crisis or a major joint operation. And that's very reassuring to allies and partners. In fact, and this is at the very beginning, I mean, we're just standing up the 2nd Fleet headquarters, has a commander and has a few people, and then we'll add capacity to the Joint Force Command Naples or Norfolk as we move forward. We'll work out the command and control diagrams, the sharing. Do we do this geographically? Do we do this in a domain-based way? We'll work with MARCOM, who's the premier, right now, the premier maritime commander, direct report to the Supreme Allied Commander. So I think it should make you happy, sir, and it's a great question that we stood this up. I thought you were going to ask me about the Balkans, but that's a whole other story. Thank you.
Jamie, let me ask you a question about the 430s. That was one of the more important deliverables from the July NATO summit. And of course, it talks about bringing online, perhaps by 2020, 30 battalions, 30 ships, 30 squadrons. What are you looking for in terms of the capability on the naval side of the 430s? What will these 30 ships do for you that you can't do now? What are you hoping they'll be able to, what kind of capabilities are you hoping, are you encouraging them to bring through this initiative in the maritime domain?
Well, I think, you look at the niche capabilities that we have in NATO that are valuable to the fight. Mine countermeasures, for example. So maintaining a robust mine countermeasure capability. When we talk about operating the Baltic, we talk about it as though we could do so with impunity. But you have to get through the Denmark Straits, and that would be something that an adversary could cause a lot of problems for NATO by mining that strait. You know, I was part of Joint Task Force Odyssey Dawn and Unified Protector for 9 months. So I was the JTF J3 for Odyssey Dawn, and then a CTF commander with NATO in the Gulf of Sidra for Unified Protector. Gaddafi dropped 4 mines in the approaches to Misrata. As we were trying to get relief supplies in there were a number of vessels going in and out of there to deliver supplies, because Misrata was like a modern-day Stalingrad. He cut the city off, he cut electricity, there were no medical supplies. People were bleeding and dying. You know, you couldn't have a child, there's no anesthesia, and we're just trying to get in there and help. And these mines show up and relief stops. And it took us a long time to get rid of those mines. We didn't have the capability and capacity and the mobility to get there and to do that. Eventually we overcame, but it took too long. So MCM is one of them. Having a variety and a mix of warships and aircraft for both ISR. ISR is key to the realm. You have to know in order to plan and to execute an operation. The only way to know is to have, you never have perfect intelligence, but you've got to have intelligence, and you get that through intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, a lot of these unmanned assets that are up there. So I would expect that that would be part of it. And then a robust mix of warships, aircraft, maneuver battalions, perhaps some with a special capability, whether that be Suburni or a special operations would be appropriate. We are not at the point where, you know, I could comment on what does this force look like, and we have a little bit of time until 2020 to get there. And again, it's going to depend on the contribution from the allies, which is what makes the 2% defense spending for GDP so important.
Great. Let me throw one last question to you before we close, because we're almost 45 minutes over. You're a submariner at heart. Your career's been in submarines. Your writing has focused on some of the challenges in the submarine domain. Your article about the fourth battle of the Atlantic talks a lot about Russian modernization, the increased stealthiness of Russian submarines, their ranges, the diversity of platforms that they have, their strike capabilities. When you look at the U.S. submarine program and the resources we're pouring into it, what areas do you think we need to be emphasizing the most in the development of our platforms and their capabilities in the subsurface realm?
Right. I think stealth first and foremost, the ability to maintain a stealthy platform, one in which has the acoustic advantage over the adversary, is essential. That's the guy who wins in the knife fight, because you can't see him, you can't hear him. And so our R&D, a lot of it is directed at stealth technology. You saw in the 2016 article, and I just saw him the other day, the Vice Admiral Dave Johnston, who now works at a different job, but he was a program executive officer for submarines at the time at the Washington Navy Yard. He's one of my neighbors when I was director of the Navy staff. Dave said, build a model of the Severodvinsk, the Russian submarine, and put it in the Naval Sea Systems Command Headquarters. That's the competition. Beat it. And I'm confident that we are, and that there is no other platform in the world that can come close to the Virginia-class submarine. But the reason for the article was, like I said, call to arms, warning order. You know, you can't sit back in your laurels and say, okay, so we produced an excellent submarine, it's very stealthy, it's very capable, it carries a great kit. You've got to innovate as you go along in each class of these ships. So there has to be, each hull has to be better than the last. And that's the challenge to industry, to be able to do that, to maintain the competitive edge. And I see my friend George Fedorov back there, who wrote the definitive piece on the Russian Navy. It's in his O&I article. I think I even brought one, George. So, George, autograph one of these for me, the Russian Navy. You can get it at www.oni.com. But this is a great piece. You know, I talk in my article about the design engineer, Igor Spassky, hero of the Soviet Union. The commonality there for Russia is over the course of time since the 60s, and George, I don't think George would disagree with me, they've continued to pour rubles into the undersea domain research and development, because they know that's a niche capability, and they want to get better than us. We have got to do the same to maintain the competitive edge. You know, our CNO was giving a great speech on the Battle of Midway, and he said that the margin to victory was razor thin. And if you study that battle, you know what he's talking about. And the margin to victory in the future in the undersea domain is razor thin. So we've got to continue to invest, continue to train, produce the best and the brightest submariners in the world in order to win the fourth battle of the Atlantic. So thanks for your question.
Admiral Foggo, Jamie, thank you very much. You've given us a very realistic assessment. And a powerful call to arms, and also a reminder of how important our alliance is. And thank you very much, and good luck to you in your service to our country.
Thank you, Ian.
Thanks a lot.